They were supposed to have it down by Thursday. That was the deadline. The backhoes came Monday morning, bright yellow against the bone-dry sky, their steel arms already coated in dust from the long haul upstate. The Ridgeway lot stretched wide and flat just off the highway, nothing but gravel, scrub grass, and an old stone grotto that looked laughably small next to the towering machines. Most of the crew hadn't even noticed the statue at first. It was tucked into a shallow alcove of weather-worn limestone, her robes faded blue, her hands folded in prayer. Just another roadside shrine. Nothing sacred, nothing to fuss over. At least, that's what they thought. The orders were clearer than most jobs like this. The lot had been sold to a development firm looking to build a strip mall anchored by a discount grocery chain. Demo first, survey second, foundations next. The grotto wasn't even marked on the blueprints. No mention in the deed's margin notes. Just a tiny cluster of bricks circled in red with the word "remove" scribbled beside it. Easy enough, except nothing about it felt easy once they got close. By mid-morning, the temperature had climbed, the machines were running, and the dust clung to skin like ash. But none of the workers moved toward the grotto. One guy, Kenny, new to the crew, was told to take a sledge and start pulling the arch apart brick by brick. He hesitated, said the air felt off over there, not hot, not cold. Just still, like it was holding its breath. A couple of the older guys chuckled, called it nerves. But no one stepped up to take his place. They gathered near the equipment, pretending to double-check instructions. A few paced the lot, staring at their boots. Even the foreman, Joe Castillo, who demoed everything from fire-damaged churches to old train stations, stood back longer than usual. "It's just stone," he muttered, but he said it too softly, like he wasn't trying to convince anyone else. It wasn't until the third time someone walked toward the statue and turned around without touching it that someone finally asked the question out loud, "Why is it even here?" No one knew for sure. A few locals driving by slowed down, their heads turning. One woman in a green sedan actually pulled over, stepped out, crossed herself, and took a photo from across the road. When asked if she knew the history, she just said, "It's been there since my grandmother was a girl," and drove away without another word. By lunchtime, nothing had been touched. Not a brick, not a bolt. The machines sat silent like they were waiting for something. A hawk circled overhead, low and slow. And in that thick, dry stillness, no one noticed that the breeze constant all morning had stopped completely. The flag on the foreman's truck hung limp. Later, they would tell themselves they had reasons. Safety checks, coordination delays, miscommunication from the office. But those were excuses. The real reason none of them swung that first hammer had nothing to do with logistics. It had to do with the way the Virgin Mary seemed to be watching. Not glaring, not judging, just waiting. Like she'd seen this kind of thing before, and like she knew how it would end. The next morning, the crew returned early, as if starting before sunrise might quiet whatever hesitation had held them back the day before. Joe Castillo arrived first. He sipped his coffee slowly, leaning against the tailgate of his truck, eyes fixed on the grotto like it might shift positions while he wasn't looking. The other men filed in behind him, lugging gear and trying not to stare. But the statue was hard to ignore. In the amber wash of dawn, her white robe caught the light, and for a moment it looked like she was glowing. No one said it out loud, but something was wrong with how easily they'd all stopped yesterday. Normally, they'd be half finished with the teardown by now. But none of them wanted to admit the reason had anything to do with a plaster figure in a hollow of stacked rock. They were practical men, not the kind to get spooked by garden statuary. And yet, here they were. Second day in a row, tools untouched, work delayed, and that quiet creeping in again. Later that morning, during their break, someone finally asked the question again, this time with a bit more weight behind it. "Seriously, though," said Miguel, a welder with 20 years under his belt, "why hasn't anyone ever torn it down before? I mean, this lot's been empty for decades." "Because no one wanted to mess with it," said Marcus, the crane assistant. "Old man who ran the diner down the street used to say his wife swore she saw her cry once. The statue, I mean, back in the 70s. Someone snorted. "Come on, what's next? Blood tears and mysterious footprints?" But no one laughed. Not really. They started sharing what little they'd heard. Nothing concrete, just scattered mentions, like fragments of a bigger story no one could piece together. A nurse from the nearby clinic used to drive by every week just to wave. Some guy swore his father was healed of cancer after praying there, though no one could name him. A woman at the real estate office apparently left flowers at the base every Easter, even after she moved 2 towns over. Still, there were no plaques, no markers, no signs proclaiming it holy ground. It didn't even sit on church property. It was just there, tucked against the slope like it had been carved out of the land itself. Old stone, quiet shade, and a statue of Mary whose paint had faded but whose eyes never seemed to change. And that was the part that really got to people, not just that she was there, but how she looked. Not cheerful, not sorrowful, just calm, as if she'd seen everything that had passed on this patch of land. As if she wasn't afraid of bulldozers or jackhammers or paperwork marked demolition. A young guy on the crew tray finally asked the foreman, "Are we sure this is even legal?" Joe didn't answer right away. He checked his clipboard, flipped through some folded permits, and then stared out at the shrine again. "Paper says tear it down," he said at last. "But paper doesn't build something like that." And for the second day in a row, not a single tool touched stone. Before there was a highway slicing through town or trucks hauling produce across Ridgeway County, there was a quiet clearing tucked at the base of a rise where wild clover grew in thick bunches, and children chased fireflies past bedtime. That's where the grotto was born. No ribbon-cutting ceremony, no press release. Just one grieving mother, a wheelbarrow full of stones, and a promise whispered in the dark. The year was 1947. The war had ended, but not for everyone. For the Ramirez family, the battles didn't stop when the soldiers came home. Their oldest son, Tomas, had been listed as missing in action in the Ardennes for nearly 2 years. The telegram came late, one stormy night, unexpected, unsigned, and simply worded, "Your son lives. He is coming home." Emilia Ramirez didn't cry when she read it. She folded the telegram carefully, kissed it, and walked outside into the rain. She stood there in her nightgown, barefoot in the mud, and looked up at the patch of land behind their house. Her husband called to her from the porch, but she didn't answer. All she said was, "I owe her." The next morning, she began clearing the brush by hand. Neighbors watched from behind their curtains. Some offered help, some didn't, but Amelia didn't ask. She dug with a rusted shovel and laid the first stones herself, stacking them unevenly until the outline of an alcove began to form. By the second week, 2 women from the parish brought her bread and stayed to lay a few more rocks. A young boy offered to carry buckets of water. Slowly, without plan or funding, something sacred took shape. The statue itself arrived in May. No one knows exactly where it came from. Some say it was gifted by a traveling priest. Others say a soldier carried it in his pack across Europe and left it at Amelia's door when she wasn't home. It was small then, maybe 3 feet tall, with soft features and blue-painted robes that had faded from long exposure to sunlight. But when she was placed into the alcove, she looked like she'd been there for centuries. People started visiting, quietly at first. A man with a limp who left walking straight. A child with a fever who smiled for the first time in weeks. The priest from street, Bernadette's, walked out one evening and simply stood in silence for over an hour. By midsummer, the grotto had become more than a family shrine. It was part of the town. No one declared it holy. There was no consecration. Just faith, passed from hand to hand like water in a drought. When Tomas finally returned, thin and shaken but alive, he placed his army medal at the base of the statue. Emilia buried it beneath the stones. "This was her doing," she said, "and we won't forget it." They didn't. And that's why, even now, nearly 80 years later, no one can explain exactly how it was built. But everyone agrees it wasn't meant to be torn down. By the time the grotto was complete, Emilia Ramirez had already begun whispering her prayers before sunrise, kneeling on cold grass while the mist still clung to the clover. No fanfare marked the final stone's placement, no parish notice, no dedication ceremony. But when the statue stood in its cradle of rock, arms open, eyes lowered, it was as if something had sealed itself into the ground. Something no rain or time could wash away. Most assumed it was just a mother's way of honoring a miracle. But a few people, those closest to the family, those who helped lay the first stones, knew there was more. They remembered the jar. It wasn't large. An old mason jar, cloudy from age, sealed with wax and wrapped in a torn strip of cloth. Emilia had held it close to her chest as they poured the final layer of mortar around the base. She hadn't asked permission. She simply stepped forward and pressed the jar deep into the wet cement, her fingers trembling. "What is it?" asked Lorraine Alvarez, just a teenager at the time, watching with wide eyes. "My promise," Amelia whispered. She kept hers. "Now I'll keep mine." The others said nothing. They helped smooth the stone around it and said not another word. But from that day on, it was understood that something sacred rested beneath that statue, not just faith, not just memory, but a binding agreement between a mother and heaven itself. Over the years, the jar was forgotten by most. Time has a way of blurring sacred moments until they feel like stories. Children grew up hearing bits and pieces, that a letter was buried, that it protected the statue, that it should never be moved. No one remembered the exact words, only that they were never meant to be disturbed. It wasn't until the early 2000s, after Amelia had passed and Tomas too, that a summer storm exposed part of the foundation. Torrential rain ate away at the dirt, revealing a sliver of something that glinted in the mud. An old man mowing grass nearby saw it and called the local church. They sent a groundskeeper. He brushed it gently with a gloved hand, saw the curve of glass, and felt something tighten in his chest, but instead of digging it out, he covered it back up. Some stories aren't meant to be reopened. The church said nothing. The man left town the following year, and once again, the memory of the jar faded into rumor, tucked away with all the other strange tales that clung to the grotto like ivy. But those who still believe, the ones who light candles before sunrise and leave flowers without a name, say that promise is still there. Not just under stone and mortar, but in the air itself. In the stillness around the statue. In the way birds never perch on her shoulders. In the way people hesitate before stepping too close. They say you can feel it if you listen long enough. Not a threat. A vow. And vows like that don't break without consequence. The first sign came on a Wednesday afternoon, quiet and strange, the way warnings often do when no one's ready to believe in them. A surveyor named Jackson Reyes had been contracted by the developers to map the Ridgeway lot's elevation lines before demolition began. He wasn't new to this work. He charted floodplains and seismic zones. He trusted his equipment more than most people. So when his digital compass began spinning in slow, erratic circles the moment he stepped within 10 feet of the grotto, he thought it was a calibration glitch. He backed up a few paces. The screen stilled. He stepped forward again. The needle spun wildly once more. "Great," he muttered, tapping the screen. He tried his analog backup just to be sure. Same result. The needle trembled, then turned in slow, uneven arcs, like it was being drawn towards something it couldn't see. Jackson stood there a while, silent in the thick heat, watching the impossible. Then, without another word, he packed his gear and left the lot. The next day, he submitted an incomplete report. When asked, he simply wrote, "Interference near statue, will revisit after demo." He didn't. Not once. The crew shrugged it off. Tech acts up. Magnets in the rock. Maybe some old electrical cable buried under the soil. There were a dozen explanations, except none of them held when tested. The ground near the statue wasn't laced with rebar. No power lines passed underfoot. The soil was bone-dry clay, not magnetic ore. But the compass wasn't the only thing acting strange. That same afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the trees, one of the newer crew members, Kevin Boyd, went to drop off a coiled extension cord beside the statue. As he leaned in, his chest brushed the outer curve of the stone arch, and every hair on his arm stood up. It wasn't static. It was something colder, deeper, like he'd stepped into a patch of winter hidden in the air. He didn't tell anyone at first, just dropped the cord and walked back to the truck without a word. But later that night at the motel, he mentioned it to his roommate, Trey. "Felt like I was being measured," he said, though he couldn't explain why that word fit. The next morning, the foreman noticed a subtle change. The men weren't moving as quickly. Tools were being handled more carefully, voices lower. They were starting to give the statue a wider berth, not because of orders but instinct. At lunch, one of the older workers, Marcus, broke the silence. "You ever get the feeling we're not supposed to be doing this?" No one answered. But the silence that followed was its own kind of agreement. Joe Castillo rubbed his temple and looked out toward the grotto. The statue was still as ever, hands folded, eyes lowered, carved in gentle peace. But the feeling wasn't peaceful anymore. It was expectant, watchful, as if she knew the first warning had already been given. It started with a whisper over coffee at Betty's cafe. Someone mentioned that the surveyor had left without finishing his measurements. Someone else claimed the crew hadn't laid a single hand on the grotto in days. By noon, the cook had heard that a bulldozer stalled just looking at it. No one knew for sure what was happening up on Ridgeway Lot, but everyone seemed to know something wasn't right. That's how things spread in towns like this. Not through headlines or press releases, but murmurs exchanged over counters, through cracked windows, on front porches as the sun slipped behind telephone poles. By dusk, the whole town was buzzing with speculation, like cicadas just before a storm. At the pharmacy, old Mrs. Lasky insisted the statue had always been protected. Said she remembered her mother calling it a packed in stone. At the barber shop, Jerry Parsons raised his voice about how a patch of bricks shouldn't get in the way of progress. But even he looked uneasy when a gust of wind knocked the clippers from his counter. At Street Bernadette's, Father Mallory received a call from one of the parishioners, a woman he hadn't heard from in years. "They're trying to move the statue," she said softly. "The one from the grotto." The priest paused. "That old thing still there?" "It is," she said. "But I don't think she wants to be." He didn't know what to make of that, but he felt it too, that shift in the air, that hum beneath the silence. Something was happening. Something that couldn't be charted in blueprints or measured in permits. By Friday morning, someone had left a bouquet of lilies at the base of the statue. Fresh, white, fragrant, with a note tucked gently between the petals. No name. Just a single sentence written in careful cursive. "She watches still." Then came the rosaries, hung one by one on the edge of the arch. Beads swaying in the breeze, catching the light like tiny constellations. They hadn't been placed there by the crew. They appeared overnight. Joe Castillo found the first one. He stared at it for a long time before calling the rest of the team over. "Anyone know who's doing this?" Nobody answered. No one needed to. They all knew it had begun. The quiet resistance, the reverent defiance. At the gas station, a woman slipped a folded newspaper into the hands of a stranger. "Page 5, she whispered. "It's starting again." On that page was a photo of the grotto taken decades ago. The article recounted a string of local legends, healings, visions, unexplainable calm during a tornado in '61. The statue had stood through all of it. And now, with bulldozers idling nearby, she still hadn't moved. They say every town has a heartbeat. That week, ridgeways began to quicken, and all of it pointed to one place, the little stone grotto off the highway where a statue stood untouched, and untouched for a reason. They tried again on a Saturday. The air was clear, the light sharp and golden, the kind of morning that makes everything look simpler than it really island. Joe Castillo had been quiet all week, keeping his head down and his radio close. He wasn't one for superstition, but something had lodged in his gut and refused to move. Still, orders were orders, and pressure from the developers was mounting. No more delays, no more excuses. Tear it down. The backhoe operator, Dale Nichols, had worked sites like this for years. Bridges, churches, even a school once that no one had stepped inside since the '50s. He wasn't afraid of stone. That morning, he climbed into his cab, fired up the engine, and guided the machine toward the grotto. It wasn't even supposed to be a direct hit, just loosening some of the old limestone near the arch. A quick push, then cleanup. But the second his bucket made contact, the teeth caught and kicked back hard, slamming the arm upward with enough force to jolt the whole cab. Dale let out a curse and backed off. He climbed down and inspected the rock, expecting to find some twisted metal rod hidden beneath. Instead, he found nothing. No steel, no support beams, just old, stacked limestone worn, weathered but ordinary. Except it wasn't. Not 10 minutes later, Miguel was securing a steel strap near the base when it coiled loose and whipped around like a rope pulled by something invisible. It didn't snap. It simply unfastened itself with a clean, fluid motion and slithered into the dirt like it didn't want to be touched again. He stood frozen for a moment before slowly backing away, his palms sweating despite the chill. That same day, a welder attempted to cut through a rusted bracket they'd found behind the shrine. The torch sputtered twice, sparked, then died completely. The fuel line was fine. The tank was full. The tip was clean. Nothing explained the failure. They checked everything, tried again. Nothing. "Bad luck," someone mumbled. But luck didn't explain the next thing. Just before lunch, Trey was coiling extension cords near the edge of the lot when he felt the ground shift. Not an earthquake, not a tremor. Just a momentary drop, as if something deep beneath had exhaled. A breath from underground. He froze, cords dangling from his hands. And then, like it had never happened, the ground stilled. Back at the equipment trailer, Joe reviewed the reports. Nothing matched. Faulty straps, seized hydraulics. Electronics that worked fine before and after, but never when aimed at the statue. And the statue? It hadn't moved an inch. Its eyes were still lowered, its hands still folded. But the peace it once seemed to radiate now felt like stillness before a storm. The kind of silence that bends trees in advance. That afternoon, Joe made a decision. They'd pull the crew off the grotto for the weekend. Reset. Regroup. Let it breathe, he muttered. But deep down, he knew they were the ones being warned. The first to hear it was Kenny Young, skeptical, still new enough to think the job was just about dirt, steel, and sweat. He was staying in a modest motel on the edge of town, the kind with creaky floorboards and air conditioners that hummed louder than the TV. It was just after 3:00 a.m. when something woke him. Not a noise, exactly. A vibration. A feeling. Like the air had grown thicker all around him. He looked at the clock. 3:33 a.m. Then he heard it. 3 slow tolls. Deep and distant. Like the sound of a church bell swallowed by fog. Not loud enough to shake the walls, but powerful enough to settle deep into his chest. 1, 2, 3. He sat up, listening. But nothing followed. No footsteps, no traffic. Just the lingering weight of the sound, as if it had traveled through time rather than space. The next morning, he didn't say anything at first. Not to Joe, not to the others. But when he caught Trey staring out the window during breakfast, his voice low, asking, "Did you hear it too?" Kenny froze. Trey had heard the exact same thing. Same time. Same tolls. They weren't the only ones. By the end of the day, at least 4 members of the crew had confessed, hesitantly, that something had woken them around the same time. A bell, they said. 3 chimes. Always 3. Marcus, the crane assistant, tried to brush it off. "Could be the clock tower from the old Baptist church," he muttered. But the Baptist church had no bell tower. It had been torn down in 1982. That evening, they returned to the Ridgeway lot to secure equipment before a forecasted storm. It was just after sunset, the air cool and damp. The statue stood in silhouette, her robes touched by the fading glow of the sky. Joe climbed out of his truck, alone, and walked to the edge of the grotto. He wasn't a religious man, not in any traditional sense, but something about the past week had started to press on him in places he didn't know he could feel. He stared at the Virgin Mary for a long time. "Look," he muttered under his breath, "I don't know what you are, but I don't think you want to be moved." He didn't expect a reply, but he got something. A shift in the wind, cold and sudden, the kind that carries the weight of a season change. Then, faint and unmistakable, 3 slow tolls echoed across the field. Clearer this time, closer. Joe didn't flinch. He just stood there, jaw set, his hands in his coat pockets. And for the first time since the job began, he whispered something back. Noted. By Monday, the Ridgeway lot had become more than a job site. It was a story, passed from table to table like a prayer in disguise. And at the center of it all stood the grotto, unchanged, unmoved, but now undeniably awake in the town's imagination. The crew had stopped trying to touch it. The machines sat idle, and people were starting to gather. One of them was Lorraine Alvarez. She hadn't walked the Ridgeway slope in years. Her knees ached too much these days, and her cane sank easily into the soft earth after last week's rain. But on that morning, she asked her niece to drive her out, to sit with her near the edge of the site, just within view of the statue. "I won't be long," she said. "I just need to remember it right." Lorraine was one of the last people alive who'd helped build the grotto. She'd been 16 in the summer of 47. Her mother had died the year before, and her father had been one of the masons who laid stone with Tomas Ramirez. Lorraine had hauled buckets of sand, poured water for mortar, and held the ladder while they sealed the arch above Mary's head. She remembered the heat, the sweat, the laughter of children weaving between wheelbarrows. And she remembered Emilia Ramirez's silent, focused, whispering prayers with every stone she placed. But that wasn't the only reason Lorraine had come. She had her own story. She waited until her niece wandered off toward the vending machine, then leaned forward slightly in her chair. The workers on site hadn't noticed her yet. She didn't mind. She just wanted to say it out loud. It was the summer of '53, she murmured, eyes never leaving the statue. There was a storm like I've never seen again. I was walking home from town with my little brother. Lightning chased us. The sky went green. We didn't think we'd make it. She paused. But the grotto, she was lit up like a lantern. No one ever believed us. Said it was just lightning. But I saw it. We stepped under that arch, and the wind died. We were dry, just standing there, watching the storm twist around us. Her hand trembled, just a little. We stayed there for 2 hours. When we walked back out, not a single drop touched us, like we'd stepped through some veil. She went quiet again. The sound of leaves rustling in the maple trees filled the air. Lorraine wasn't the kind of woman who made things up. She'd raised 5 kids, buried 2 husbands, and worked the same bakery for 40 years. But that story, she'd only ever told it twice before. And now, looking at the equipment scattered around the base of the hill, she understood why the memory had come back so strong. She looked at the statue, her voice soft. She saved us once, and I don't think she's done. By evening, her words had made their way across town. And by morning, the crowd had doubled. The second attempt wasn't announced. No town notice. No heads up to the crew. Just a quiet directive from the developers, delivered through a terse email late Sunday night. Begin phase 1. No further delays. Joe Castillo read it twice. Then once more, just to be sure it said what he thought it did. By dawn Monday, the backhoe and bulldozer were positioned. This time, they weren't going to dance around the statue. The plan was simple. Use the bulldozer to collapse the stone arch, then cart off the rubble piece by piece. No need for delicate removal. No more hesitations. The air felt different that morning. It had rained lightly overnight, but the sky had cleared with the sunrise. A low mist clung to the gravel, and the grass was still heavy with dew. The statue looked the same, peaceful, unmoved, but there was something about the light. It hit her face just right, enough to make even the most practical men feel like they were being watched. "Let's get this over with," muttered Dale Nichols, who had volunteered maybe too quickly to run the bulldozer this time. He wasn't one for ghost stories. He hadn't heard the bell, and he wasn't losing sleep over an old chunk of concrete, no matter how many stories the town cooked up. He climbed into the cab, turned the key, and the machine roared to life. The others stepped back. The bucket lowered. The gravel crunched under the treads as he rolled forward, slow, deliberate, focused. Then it happened. The moment the blade reached within 2 feet of the grotto, the engine coughed. Just once. Then again, and then, with a sputtering grind, it died completely. Dale cursed, twisted the key, nothing. Not even a click. He radioed for a jump. Trey brought over the truck. They tried twice. Still nothing. "Battery's dead," Dale said, frowning. "It was brand new," Trey replied. They lifted the hood. The battery wasn't just drained, it was bulging, like something inside had swelled from the inside out. The terminals were scorched. The smell was sharp, acrid, unnatural. They towed the bulldozer away. But that wasn't the end, because later that afternoon, when a second machine was brought in, a newer model, freshly delivered from the neighboring county, it wouldn't start at all. Fully charged, full tank, inspected just hours before. No ignition, just silence. That silence stretched into the crew. No one joked anymore. No one pretended it was just bad wiring or faulty parts. They stood near the edge of the lot, hands in pockets, staring at the statue. Trey, quiet as ever, finally said what no one else wanted to. "She doesn't want us here." No one argued. That night, a few of the workers went back up on their own. Not with tools, but with candles. They placed them near the base and stood back. No words. No prayers. Just flickering flames and eyes turned toward a figure who had refused to fall. By Tuesday morning, the tone on the lot had shifted completely. The men still showed up, still clocked in, still moved crates and checked straps, but no one touched the grotto. Not anymore. What had started as a job site had become something quieter, more careful. The machines sat still beneath plastic tarps. The tools stayed in their boxes. Conversations were hushed. Radios turned low. Even the gravel underfoot seemed to crunch more softly, like the ground itself had grown sensitive to sound. And then, slowly, they began to pray. Not all of them. Not at once. And not in the way you'd expect. There were no choruses of Hail Marys or open-air sermons. It began with Marcus, the crane assistant. He wasn't Catholic, never even set foot in a church outside of weddings. But something about the statue gnawed at him, how it refused to fall, how it seemed to stare past him without judgment. That morning, while the others unpacked cables, he walked over to the base of the shrine, removed his hard hat, and stood in silence. Just stood, hands clasped, head bowed, nothing dramatic. But the silence around him deepened. Trey joined him the next day. Then Miguel. Then the youngest, Kenny, who hadn't believed a word of it until the dream he'd had the night before, a vivid scene of the statue shattering, followed by water flooding the town like the sea had returned for something it was owed. Even Joe, who'd once joked about ghost stories in a town with too much free time, found himself lingering beside the statue before the day's start. He didn't kneel, he didn't speak. But once, someone saw him reach out and lightly brush dust off the stone's base, as if making peace, as if apologizing. By Thursday, a folding chair had appeared near the grotto. No one claimed it, no one moved it. But each afternoon, someone different sat in it for a few minutes, not to rest but to be near her. Near the one who hadn't spoken, hadn't moved, hadn't demanded a thing, and yet had changed every man on that hill. They started leaving things. A set of dog tags, a rusted key, a slice of bread wrapped in plastic with a note, for the one who watches. Small offerings from people who had nothing to prove but everything to feel. And while the developers sent emails and demanded updates, the crew said little in return. They became slow to respond. Delays, they claimed, technical issues. But really, none of them wanted to be the one to try again. They weren't afraid of punishment. They were afraid of breaking something they didn't understand. Something older than contracts and cement. Faith, it turned out, didn't need a pulpit. Sometimes, it just needed stillness. A few quiet men standing in the presence of a statue that wouldn't let itself be moved. And so, the work paused, and the prayers began. His name was Brian Marston, and he didn't believe in ghosts, saints, or miracles. What he did believe in was concrete, cold, measurable, and profitable. He arrived in Ridgeway wearing polished shoes, a pressed jacket, and an attitude that hovered somewhere between irritated and bored. To him, the delays were just excuses. Backhoes didn't get stage fright. Workers didn't feel watched. Machinery didn't break because of vibes. He stepped onto the lot like it belonged to him. After all, he'd signed the contracts. He'd poured the money into the project. This land was slated for a parking structure, 4 stories tall, with LED lighting and electric vehicle stations. Not a sacred site, not a shrine built by hands long dead. He looked at the statue, arms outstretched, face lowered in eternal calm, and scoffed. "This," he said, turning to Joe, "this is what's stopping progress." Joe didn't answer. Marston waved a hand toward the idle machines. "They look fine to me. Fire 'em up. Let's make something useful out of this hillside." The crew didn't move. No one touched a lever. No one stepped toward the grotto. "Am I speaking English?" Marston snapped. Miguel glanced at Joe. Joe met Marston's stare. "We've had issues." Marston let out a short laugh. "I've heard the rumors. Bells in the night, haunted machinery, the statue that won't move. You all been drinking on the job or just reading too many internet forums?" He walked past them, straight toward the statue. Gravel crunched under his expensive shoes. He stood directly in front of her, hands on his hips. "Well," he muttered, "let's see what all the fuss is about." He reached out, and the wind stopped. It was sudden, startling. Not a gradual hush, but a silencing like the whole lot had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. No breeze, no rustling leaves. Just stillness so complete it made Marston pause with his hand midair. "Must be my lucky day," he said, trying to mask the unease growing in his voice. He touched the statue's hand, and instantly recoiled. "Jesus!" he hissed, yanking his palm back like he touched a stovetop. He examined it, no burn, no mark, no injury. But his fingers trembled. "She's cold," he muttered, shaken. "Freezing." Joe stepped closer. "It's 83 degrees out." Marston didn't reply. He stared at the statue for a long time before slowly backing away. He didn't speak for the rest of the visit, just walked to his car, started the engine, and drove off without another word. The next morning, the crew received an email from his assistant. Project Ridgeway is temporarily paused for reassessment. They never saw Marston again. But someone noticed something strange that day. The flowers at the base of the statue, lilies and wild daisies, had turned to face the arch. Not the Sunday, just the stone, and the woman standing within it. No one knows where the little girl came from. Not exactly. Some say she was visiting family from out of state. Others remember seeing her a week before, sitting quietly at the back of street. Bernadette's during Mass, her hair braided, her shoes too big, her hands folded in her lap like she'd been taught to pray in another time. What everyone agrees on is that she came to the Ridgeway lot alone. It was late afternoon when she walked up the hill, unnoticed at first. The men had stepped away for lunch, and the sun hung low over the pines. She moved with a calmness beyond her years, barely 10, maybe younger, and stopped just short of the base of the grotto. A silence settled as if the land itself recognized her arrival. Trey was the first to see her. He blinked, confused. "Hey, sweetheart, you lost?" But the girl didn't turn around. She just reached out her small hand and gently placed it on the statue's robe, her fingers brushing the stone like greeting an old friend. That's when she spoke. Not in English, not in Spanish. In Latin. Trey's jaw tightened. He couldn't make out the words exactly, but the cadence was unmistakable, solemn, rhythmic, reverent. It didn't sound rehearsed. It sounded remembered. "Salve, Regina," she whispered, voice light as wind through the trees. "Mater misericordia." Joe had walked over by then, joined by Miguel. They stood frozen, watching this girl barely tall enough to reach Mary's elbow speak words older than the town itself. "Do you understand her?" Joe asked quietly. Miguel nodded. "It's the Hail Holy Queen." They listened as she continued, word for word, not stumbling, not hesitating. Her voice rose, ever so slightly, and for a moment it felt like the air bent to hold her prayer, like even the trees leaned in closer. When she finished, she opened her eyes. "She's not asleep," the girl said, almost to herself. "What's your name?" Joe asked, kneeling gently beside her. She looked at him with the kind of calm that unnerved grown men. "She knows you're trying to move her," she said instead. Joe swallowed. "We're not anymore." "Good," the girl said, "because if she leaves, something follows." The words chilled him more than the cold wind that returned just then, brushing across their arms. She turned without another word and began walking down the slope, her feet barely scuffing the gravel. Trey jogged after her, but when he reached the bottom, she was gone. No trace, no footprints, just the wind and the quiet sway of leaves. That evening, Joe called Father Mallory. "Do you know what the girl meant?" he asked. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I think," the priest said carefully, "she meant that the statue doesn't just mark a place of safety. It holds something back." And suddenly, the thought of removing it didn't just feel impossible. It felt dangerous. The photo appeared online first quietly, anonymously, posted to a small local Facebook group dedicated to Ridgeway history. No caption, no filter. Just a grainy, black and white image of the grotto taken decades ago. The stone looked newer, untouched by lichen and time. The statue stood tall, serene. But it wasn't the Virgin Mary that caught attention. It was the man standing beside her. At first glance, he seemed ordinary. Wearing a faded work shirt, slacks held up with suspenders, one hand on his hip, the other resting on the edge of the arch. But when you zoomed in, when you really looked, you saw the truth. The man had no eyes. Not in the way a photo might blur or fade. His sockets were sunken, shadowed, empty. Not hollow like damage, but intentional, as if something had erased them. Smoothed them out like an old fresco wiped clean. And yet, somehow, he still seemed to be looking directly at the camera. Within minutes, the image spread. Comments poured in. Some called it a hoax. Others claimed it was a trick of the light, a camera error. But a few older users recognized the man at least by reputation. "Looks like old Harlan Bexley," one comment read. "He laid the first stone." Another added, "He went blind the day the statue was finished. Said he saw something in the cement that wasn't meant to be seen." Suddenly, the town remembered him. The story was always passed around as a kind of joke. Harlan, the man who stared too long at the statue and lost his sight. Some said it happened while mixing mortar. Others claimed he opened the sealed jar buried beneath the foundation. But the details didn't matter. The warning always ended the same. He saw something no man was meant to see. Joe printed the photo and brought it to the site. He didn't show it to the developers. He didn't send it to corporate. He just passed it around the crew in silence. Each man studied it. Each man reacted the same way, quiet, then a subtle shake of the head, like trying to dislodge the weight it left behind. Kenny finally spoke. He's not blind, he said. He's erased. That night, Miguel had a dream. He stood on the Ridgeway lot, alone, as fog rolled in. The statue stood untouched, but the man from the photo stood beside her, real, tall, waiting. No eyes, just blank skin. And in the dream, he turned his head toward Miguel and opened his mouth. But no words came. Only the sound of stone cracking deep underground. Miguel woke up gasping. And when he checked his phone, he had a single new message from an unknown number. It was the photo. But this time, the man was closer. It began with the ground, not a quake, not a rumble, but a soft popping sound, like knuckles being cracked beneath the soil. Joe heard it first while walking the perimeter. Just a faint shift beneath his boots, barely audible, but wrong. The kind of sound that doesn't belong to nature or machine. He stopped and listened. Then it happened again. Pop, pop, pop. Silence. Later that day, Trey noticed hairline fractures on the west side of the lot. They weren't there before. They ran like veins through the dirt, perfectly straight, as if something precise had pushed upward. Not from water, not from erosion. These were lines of pressure intentional. Joe called in a geotechnical specialist from the city. The man arrived with ground-penetrating radar and a polite smile. He did his scan, made his notes, and then frowned at the results. "This land's not shifting," he said. "It's bracing." "And for what?" Joe asked. The man didn't answer. That night, the rain came heavy. Sheets of it poured down the hillside, and the crew secured what they could. Most went back to the motel. Joe stayed behind, something gnawing at him like a whisper he couldn't quite catch. That's when he heard it. Coming from the storm drain near the southern fence, half buried under brush, corroded with rust. He stepped toward it slowly, rain soaking his jacket, breath misting in the cold. A voice. At first, he thought it was wind or water, but the cadence was too clean. A woman's voice, soft, rhythmic, like a lullaby spoken through stone. He knelt near the grate. "Hello?" The voice continued. Not loud, not urgent, just persistent. He leaned closer. It wasn't English. It wasn't Spanish. It was Latin. He recognized fragments, phrases Trey had translated from the girl's prayer. But this was different, darker. Not a plea for mercy, but a warning. Over and over, the same phrase. "No li tangre, custodi." Do not touch, she guards. Joe stumbled back, heart pounding. The voice cut off instantly, as if it had known it was heard. By morning, the cracks in the earth had widened. Miguel found one near the statue, almost perfectly straight, stretching from the base of the grotto all the way to the property's edge. It hadn't been there before. The roots of nearby trees had split open like something underneath was breathing. Joe didn't report it. He just marked it with orange flags and walked away. Later, when Trey checked the storm drain, the voice was gone. But the grate had shifted, tilted, as if something beneath had pressed against it during the night. Kenny tried to laugh it off, but no one joined him. And when Lorraine Alvarez visited again that afternoon, she simply stared at the growing cracks and whispered, "You're waking it up." The rain didn't let up for 4 days. Not a storm, just constant, relentless drizzle, the kind that soaked through your collar and into your bones. Ridgeway turned gray, streets glistened like mirrors, gutters overflowed, and the Ridgeway lot became a swamp. The statue stood unaffected. While most of the crew stayed in, Miguel and Trey made their way to the site in ponchos, boots caked in mud. They weren't there to work just to see. It had become that kind of job now, not about construction. About watching. About wondering what would happen next. They weren't prepared for what they found. The concrete slab near the south corner of the site had shifted during the rain. It was old, once used for storing supplies back when the grotto was first built. The slab had always been plain, no markings, just moss along the edge. But now, there were handprints. Not painted, not drawn, impressed. 2 hands, side by side, palms down. Human-sized but delicate. The fingers were long, too long. And the cement around them had cracked not like wear, but like something had pushed up from underneath. Trey crouched beside them. "Were these always here?" Miguel shook his head slowly. "I would have seen them." They reached down but stopped short of touching them. There was something wrong with the temperature. The rain felt warm, but the air around the prints had gone cold. Not natural cold, hollow, echoing, like the breath of something deep underground. That evening, word spread. The crew gathered under the tarp near the equipment trailer, silent. No one wanted to be the first to admit what they were thinking, that whatever lay beneath that statue wasn't asleep anymore. Kenny finally said it. Those prints, they're not pressed in. Joe looked at him. What do you mean? They're rising out. Silence. And then, as if in response, thunder cracked overhead, not loud, but sharp, close, like a door slamming in the sky. Rain poured harder. The tarp shook. Everyone looked toward the statue. She was soaked, of course, but not weathered, not eroded. She looked clean, preserved, as if the water had been falling around her, not on her. That night, the storm grew worse. Streets flooded. The school canceled classes. The church bells rang once in the distance by accident, they said, but no one could explain how. At 2:12 a.m., a maintenance worker checking drainage along the highway called dispatch in a panic. He'd seen something near the base of the Ridgeway lot. In the water, ripples, circular, concentric, spreading outward, as if something large had moved beneath the earth, or risen. By morning, the handprints had deepened, and the rain hadn't stopped. The decision came from above, higher than the developers. Someone in a suit, someone in a tower, someone who had never stepped foot in Ridgeway but had grown tired of delay reports and ghost stories. The order was simple. Clear the lot, no exceptions. Joe read the email and didn't respond. He just stared at it. Then he stood, stepped outside, and watched the rain fall on the gravel, now more mud than stone. Behind him, the crew sat in silence. No one spoke. They all knew what was coming, the final push. The last attempt. Friday morning arrived like a funeral. The sky was a pale bruise, clouds swollen and unmoving. A crane had been brought in from 2 towns over industrial, new, untouched by the strange malfunctions that plagued the Ridgeway site. They moved quickly, pretending not to notice how the air had changed. No birds, no wind, just the low hum of engines and the occasional splash of boots in pooled water. The plan was to tether the statue from above, gently pull it out of the arch, then lower it into a padded crate. A clean extraction, sterile, controlled. By 9:00 a.m., the cables were secured. By 9:07 a.m., the crane lifted. And then everything went wrong. The moment the statue's feet left the stone, the wind screamed. Not a gust, not a gale, a scream. High, sharp, almost human, the kind of sound that rattles in your jawbone and hollows out your chest. The cables jerked. The crane groaned. The crew stumbled backward as the sky darkened, not gradually, but instantly, as though a massive curtain had been yanked across the Sunday day, became dusk. Then, darker. The only light left was from the work lamps, now flickering violently. Joe shouted, "Lower it, now!" The crane began to descend, but the statue didn't. The cables unwound like thread from a spool, spinning, snaking, unraveling midair. Sparks flew from the motor. The operator screamed. The controls locked. And then, the cable snapped. But the statue didn't fall. It hovered for a breath, maybe 2 in perfect silence. And then it returned to the ground. Gently, like it had never moved at all. The crane powered down. The lights blew out. And the sky went fully black. Lightning struck the hill once. Then again, but never touched the statue. By the time the light returned, the crew had scattered. Some fled to their trucks. Others dropped to their knees in the mud. Joe remained, standing motionless, soaked, staring at the statue as if seeing it for the first time. Trey approached him, trembling. "Did we just?" Joe didn't answer, but from the corner of his eye, he saw something. In the soil around the base of the statue, new cracks, wide and deep, spreading like veins beneath the earth. From them, a faint mist rose, cold, fragrant, like myrrh. And beneath it all, faint but clear, chanting, coming from the ground. From below, no alarms went off that night. No crews were called in. No authorities notified. By morning, Ridgeway's skies had cleared, as if the storm had never happened. Birds returned to the trees. The wind moved normally again. Everything looked, on the surface, as it once had. Except the grotto, except the ground. Joe arrived before sunrise. He wasn't sure why. Habit, maybe. Guilt, maybe more. His boots hit the muddy slope with less resistance than usual. The puddles were gone. The air was dry. Then he saw it. Where the statue once stood, surrounded by open space and exposed roots and broken cable, the entire grotto had transformed. The stone arch had closed in on itself. Not crumbled, not collapsed. Sealed. Like stone had grown overnight, fusing together in seamless curves and folds. The entrance was gone, replaced by a wall of perfectly smooth limestone, veined in patterns no mason could ever replicate. There were no tool marks, no erosion. Just the faint outline of two hands pressed into the center of the stone, one larger, one smaller. Familiar. Joe walked to it slowly, touched it. It was warm. Behind him, the others began to arrive first. Miguel, then Trey, then Kenny and the rest. No one spoke. They just stood there, staring at something they'd been trying to destroy for weeks, and now could not reach at all. Father Mallory was the last to arrive. He stepped forward, fingers tracing the sealed stone as if it were scripture. "It's not just sealed," he murmured. "It's protected." They stood in silence for a long time. Then Lorraine Alvarez arrived, helped down the slope by her niece once more. She didn't ask questions. She didn't blink. She only nodded slowly and whispered, "She's decided to stay." By evening, word spread that the Ridgeway project was canceled. No formal announcement, no press release. Just a quiet understanding passed from mouth to mouth, like a town-wide exhale. The machines were packed, the workers dismissed, but the lot remained untouched. The developers never returned. Brian Marston resigned 3 weeks later and moved out of state. His reason: personal clarity. As for the statue, no one ever saw her again. No photos, no footage. But visitors still came. They'd walk the slope, leave candles, press their hands to the smooth, warm stone. Some said they heard singing. Others felt heat radiate from the wall. A few wept without knowing why. And occasionally, at night, if you stood near the sealed grotto and listened very carefully, you might hear it. 3 slow tolls. Then silence. But deep beneath the earth, something remains, watching, waiting, guarding. Not a monument. Not a warning. A covenant carved in stone.